Kia ora. Welcome to another GI seminar, and we're very fortunate to have an excellent School of Forestry at UC. Does a lot of geospatial work, particularly using LiDAR. GRI host David, sitting at the back there, a PhD student in forestry. So we thought it was about time to get Justin over, who's been engaged with the GRI since its beginning, to give it an overview of the work that you do in the school and all about presumably more than LiDAR data, but that's going to be a key theme. I've said enough already. Just welcome and enjoy the talk. Thank you, Justin, for joining us. I'm here. Hopefully the battery will last. Yeah, just about out halfway.
Okay, there we go. Hey, my name is Justin. So yeah, I'm from the School of Forestry. Matt mentioned that, yeah, I've got a bit of a relationship with GRI from the early days, and so happy to see it going from strength to strength. I really enjoyed a talk earlier this year where it was a bit of a GRI retrospective that was given. I think it was Malcolm who possibly gave that talk. So it was really nice to see the GRI going from strength to strength. And also the mention of Dave, who's sitting at the back there quietly. Yeah, he was funded through generous funding through the GRI scholarship program. So obviously, you know, the School of Forestry has benefited directly from that with Dave's involvement. And you know, I'm glad to see that program continuing. So when I got asked to do this talk, I guess I wanted to focus on my own personal interests. So my research group as a whole works with remote sensing data in all sort of forested environments. We probably split most of our research amongst the urban forestry side, which is my primary interest, and the production forestry side, which is my colleague Vega's interest. We dabble a little bit in natural forests as well, but basically, as long as there's trees and there's remote sensing involved, we're interested, right? So, as I said, I wanted to focus my talk, I guess, on urban forestry, and I'll start with this. I was at a conference just a month ago, and it was an international conference in Vancouver. And they did that thing that they do at a lot of conferences where they say, you know, where have you come from? How far did you travel to get here? And inevitably, as long as you're from New Zealand, you know that you're always the person who's traveled the furthest to any given conference, right? So of course, I was the person who traveled furthest to the conference, and so I got a chance to sort of talk to people about New Zealand. And one of the core themes was sort of, what do you know about New Zealand? Do you guys want to take guesses as to what types of answers I got? Sheep, definitely. Sheep was right up there. Yes, absolutely. What's rugby? Yeah, absolutely. It's in Lord of the Rings. Okay, yeah, definitely. Yeah, right. Yeah. Yes, all those things and more. What's that? Sorry. Maori. Yeah, actually, that one did come up. Yeah, that one did come up. Absolutely. Believe it or not, that one didn't come up. No. But I told them about it. No. So the other big one that you probably haven't mentioned is sort of just the outdoor spaces, the big outdoor spaces, the vast sort of environment that New Zealand is so famous for. In fact, so famous for it that it's been at the heart of our tourism campaigns for many, many, many decades. You've undoubtedly seen posters like these, or the modern equivalent. These are from the 1950s. We've been selling ourselves as a country internationally as this sort of clean, green environmental paradise for many, many, many decades. And continuing on with the theme of those posters, at some stage along the line, they even decided that it wasn't just about nature, it was about people getting into nature. So they started to include people in their posters. So people out hiking, people in vehicles driving to these wonderful sort of locations with incredible, beautiful environments. Now, I don't know whether you've looked into what it costs to do any of these things. First of all, there's an implication that you can drive to these places. I have a car. I don't know what proportion of the population in cities have cars and have enough money to pay for fuel to get to these locations. But I just looked at this one this morning. This is if you want to get a Milford Track guided walk, 3,000 New Zealand dollars per person. There's a cost to these experiences. There's a big cost to these experiences, even if you don't pay for the high-end sort of real journey style vacations. There's a cost to these types of experiences. And so I guess one of the conclusions that I've drawn is that, yeah, that nature out there is fantastic. I love getting in and amongst it as much as possible. But the reality is, for the vast majority of us, the nature that we're going to interact with 9 times out of 10, 99 times out of 100, in fact, is going to be nature in our cities. So nature in our cities, in my view, is not only just as important, but actually far more important than all of those wonderful outdoor spaces that we have in rural New Zealand. Oh, there we go. So talking about the theme of cities, talking about the theme of why it's important to have nature in our cities, this captures it a little bit. For about the last 15 years, from a global perspective, more people have lived in cities than have lived outside of cities. We're expected to see that trend continue, with some estimates suggesting by 2050, up to 70% of the world's population will be in cities. So our cities are places where the vast majority of the global population resides. Some cities do it well. So you see Auckland on the left. Auckland is a city that I guess reputationally has good green spaces, good urban forest cover, good access to nature right within the city. And some cities do it very, very poorly. At right is a city in Texas, where you can see that sort of, I guess, greenfield development, sort of suburbia that large parts of the world are quite famous for. I think the vast majority of people in this room can see themselves enjoying, a bit of life in Auckland, but maybe not so much the lifestyle that's provided to them in this suburb in Texas. So the argument that I make typically with urban forestry is that, yeah, again, it's great to have nature out there, but what we really need is we need nature, and we need green spaces, and we need trees in our cities. We need trees in our cities where we live, we need trees in our cities where we work, and we need trees in our cities where we play. That's critically important because that's the nature that we're going to interact with on a daily basis. It's the nature that we're going to interact with when we take our dogs for a walk, when we bike to work, when we drive to work, when we take a little break at work and go out for a coffee. It's the nature that we interact with the vast majority of the time, and thus I believe it's critically important. But it's not just the fact that I believe it's critically important. Why do urban forests, why do green spaces have this reputation as being I guess important for city dwellers? Well, it's because there are many benefits. So I'm sort of strictly focusing here on urban forests, but it equally applies to green spaces as a whole. There are a huge number of different benefits for urban green spaces. We know that trees improve air quality. There's lots of studies that have basically looked at the relationship between trees, green spaces, and various measures of air quality, particulate matter being one particular use case that sees quite a lot of research. We've seen that trees and green spaces can really improve thermal comfort in our cities. Are there any French readers in the room? Nobody? One? What does that one on the left say? I've come prepared for the eventuality that possibly nobody spoke French, so I do have a translation. So this is from Le Monde in 2022 in Paris. Heat wave likely to have caused over 11,000 additional deaths in France this summer. There's a real I guess relationship between urban environments and urban heat islands, and that's only exacerbated by climate change. So we see trees playing a really important role there in improving thermal comfort, reducing those extremes. And we can see that through data, we can see that through health outcomes, but we can also just see it through just looking around and watching how people behave during hot days. Image from Spain on the left, image from Havana and Cuba on the right. These are just simple images that just show the importance and the value of trees and green spaces during particularly hot events or hot days. We certainly know that trees improve health outcomes. This is a study that I quite like. This is from Toronto. I've highlighted a key point here. We find that having 10 more trees in a city block on average improves health perception in ways comparable to an increase in annual personal income of $10,000 or being 7 years younger. So, I mean, I can paraphrase that. Basically, trees make us feel richer and they make us feel younger. And that's got to be a great thing. And it's not just about feelings. This is real. Again, the science backs this up. This is a really cool practical example of that. This is an example from the UK, where they've been looking at the use of green social prescribing for dealing with mental health issues. They through a GP, you can get a referral to a program that allows you to spend 10 weeks in these natural areas, in these outdoor areas filled with green space and parks and trees, and get one-on-one sessions with qualified professionals who will basically help you through the mental health issues that you happen to be going through. These programs have been demonstrated to show a 40% decrease in GP visits in the subsequent 6 months, with participants in these programs scoring substantially lower on depression severity and anxiety, and substantially higher on life satisfaction and sense of purpose. So again, real outcomes that demonstrate the value of trees and green spaces in our cities. And if I sort of summarize all of that, the whole trees have benefits thing, essentially what it comes down to is that trees are a great investment in our cities. The reality is every dollar that we spend on trees provide us with many dollars in return in terms of their benefits. And that's not lost on local authorities. That's not lost on decision makers who work for local councils and district councils. In fact, in recognition of these benefits, a lot of cities out there have actually set canopy cover targets, canopy cover goals. So what that means is basically they have recognized the benefits that come with trees. They've recognized that having more trees equals more benefits. And as a consequence, they've set targets for themselves to achieve greater canopy cover. And I give you the examples here. This is a figure from a recent publication, but I give you the examples here of Christchurch and Auckland. Auckland has set a canopy cover target of 30% canopy in the city, and Christchurch has set a target of 20%. Now, targets are great. They're a wonderful sort of policy device. They're something that's typically very easily communicated by politicians, so they tend to like them as well. But it does introduce a bit of a challenge, which is, well, how do we actually measure canopy cover? How do we know what the current canopy cover is, and how do we measure future change towards that target? And that's where a lot of the remote sensing side of stuff comes in. So up to now, what I've focused on is sort of the broader context for urban forests and why they're important. And now I'll sort of start bringing in some of the remote sensing side of things. So again, one of the goals that we have is to accurately measure urban tree canopy, and not just once, but over time. We need to be able to see how we're tracking towards these various different targets. So there are a number of different ways that we can measure urban tree canopy. We can undertake either sampling or mapping approaches. From a sampling perspective, we can undertake this through ground-based approaches, so just sending teams of people around who will essentially go to plots that have been randomly distributed in a city and measure from the ground what the canopy cover is within that plot as a percentage. We can do a similar thing through desktop approaches, so just scattering a variety of different points throughout a locality, and then using imagery, determine whether each of those points hit trees or not trees, and get a good estimate of tree canopy that way. We can also undertake mapping approaches. Again, this is typically through the use of remote sensing. We can undertake mapping approaches where we literally delineate the boundary of canopy within a certain locality, and get a pretty good view of not only how much canopy we have, but where it is. So these are all different approaches, and I guess within our research group, we've done all of those to some degree. And I'll give you an example. So this is some work that my colleague, Dr. Ningye, and I have been working on for a number of years. This work benefited from some funding from MPI. They have a program that sponsors students to do internships over their summer months, and we've been able to take some of those students and set them the task of using point sampling to estimate canopy cover in the 75 largest cities in New Zealand. And so that's what we've done. We've now got a good understanding of what canopy cover is in basically every city that is larger than 3,000 people in the country. And we know through the sampling approach that that canopy cover ranges between 7.5% and 59% in New Zealand cities, and that the average sort of canopy cover is 19.3%. So what we've done through this program is we've provided those 75 cities with a report telling them what their sort of baseline is, what their current canopy is, and we've told those cities that this is what you can do with that type of data. This is how you can use it to inform policy or strategy. These are the additional steps that you can take to add more value to that data, so on and so forth. So having that basic data gives most councils who couldn't afford to do it otherwise just some baseline data to better understand what their urban forest resource is. And I think that's important because I think, the reality is a lot of councils would easily be able to quantify the costs associated with managing green spaces and trees, but they would have no idea what the value of those urban forest green spaces are. So that's sort of I guess a step in the right direction. And as I say, we undertook a point sampling approach for this. I'll just give you an example here. So this is our research group website, and we basically have put these different canopy cover sampling units up here on Google Earth Engine, so we can just choose any city that we want. Does anybody have a particular favorite city that they'd like to see? Anybody from anywhere? Let's go Nelson. Nelson's always been a favorite of mine. So you just click on Analyze, and it basically, with a little bit of luck, will bring us to Nelson. It'll show the 1,000 points that were overlaid within Nelson's urban boundary, and it will color code those points to whether or not they were visually assessed as being trees or not trees. So this gives anybody who has this website an opportunity to go and check out the data. One of the things that we're looking at is giving the public the ability to basically provide feedback on each of those points, so that we can continuously update these canopy cover values without us having to redo the assessments every few years. So we're looking at the possibility of adding some sort of, I guess, public, I don't know whether it's feedback or just the ability to allow public to change point values. I'm not entirely sure, but we're working through that. So again, that's relatively simple. The only sort of way that remote sensing works into this at all is that the assessors used underlying aerial imagery and LiDAR data to be able to make assessments as to whether each of those points actually hit a tree or not. So the analysis is incredibly simple. It just required a bit of brute force on the part of the student interns, and what we were able to do is provide quite a cool tool for those 75 councils that we undertook the analysis for. So, as I say, that's relatively basic. And what that point sampling tells us is how much urban tree cover. So we know now for those 75 cities that they have 8% canopy cover, or they have 15% canopy cover, or they have 38% canopy cover, but it doesn't tell us where canopy is, and that's a big limitation. So luckily in New Zealand, we have a wealth of freely accessible remotely sensed data sets. And through the use of that data, we can do better than just point sampling. We can actually map canopy cover with a fair degree of accuracy. So what you see on the right there is the current status of the aerial laser scanning or LiDAR data sets that are available nationwide. You can see that for the vast majority of the country, and in particular the vast majority of the country where people live, we have LiDAR data sets available. And some of them are a little bit older. Some of them sort of are from 10 plus years ago. But generally speaking, for most of the populated places, we've got reasonably recent LiDAR data sets. And those LiDAR data sets range in quality from a couple of points per square meter all the way up to maybe 25, 30 points per square meter. So the newer data sets in particular are quite high quality, and they allow for not only regional analysis, but also analysis within individual cities or smaller scale like that. In addition to the LiDAR data, which we find so valuable for our work, we have a wonderful sort of historic repository of aerial imagery. And those data sets tend to get updated on a fairly regular cycle between something like 3 and 5 years. Now, we've played around with both of these types of data sets. Some of our initial work, I guess, was based on the combination of the LiDAR data and the aerial imagery. But what we're finding is because of the cost of acquisition of LiDAR, some councils are actually foregoing it and just updating their aerial imagery. So what we need was techniques that would allow us to map canopy cover with just aerial imagery alone. And so we're moving more and more into the deep learning space using simple RGB imagery to do I guess canopy delineation. So that's sort of some of the work that we're doing there, and it's led to a variety of different products. Here are some citywide products that we've created over the past decade or so. So this is canopy cover mapping for Christchurch, for Wellington on the right, and for Auckland in the middle. So I was directly involved with the Wellington and the Christchurch one, and my master's student at the time, now PhD student, soon to finish, undertook the Auckland one. So again, using combinations of LiDAR data and RGB imagery, we were able to sort of map canopy cover within each of those cities. And I guess as a consequence of that, we've had some cool opportunities to work with other people to look at interesting relationships between canopy and other things. In this case, I worked with a data journalist at Stuff called Kate Newton to produce this article called The Green Divide, where she looked at Auckland tree cover by wealth decile. And so what she was able to demonstrate is that there's a pretty good relationship between wealth decile, 1 being the wealthiest, 10 being the poorest, and the canopy cover in those neighborhoods. So I guess producing the maps is one thing, but then taking that as a product and turning it into something else is one of the things I really value. And getting to work with people like Kate Newton is really quite exciting, because they can take sort of a basic data set and use it to answer really interesting questions. So I think that's a real value of these sort of basic data sets. The mapping that we do is able to tell us how much UTC we have, so how much urban tree canopy we have. The mapping that we do can tell us where canopy is and where canopy isn't, and as a consequence be used to look at questions of equity and so forth. But the mapping that we do, at least with a single timestamp, can't tell us how canopy cover is changing over time. So that idea of, the city has set a target, how do we track progress towards that target? We still can't do that with a single timestamp yet. So that's where the multi-temporal canopy assessment comes into play. The work that I've done for the City Council in Christchurch here, we've done 2 time steps so far. So the first one for the 2015-2016 imagery that showed roughly 15.6% canopy cover in the city, and the subsequent analysis for the 2018-19 imagery that showed a decrease down to about 13.6%. Or a decrease of about 2% canopy cover over the city. So that was an important exercise for the city, because it actually preceded their urban forest strategy. It preceded their setting of a target of 20%. And what they were able to argue was that we've set a target of 20%, but we're actually going backwards. We really need budget to address this. And so they were able to turn this data into a compelling argument to get budget to turn things around. So again, I think the power of data to be able to link that to not only strategic decisions, but to lead that to financial investment is very, very powerful. So again, at the citywide scale, we can do things like this, and we can see, which areas have lost canopy cover, which areas have gained canopy cover. And in this particular case, what we see is actually the vast majority of the losses that we saw was in the plantation forest areas, Wattle Lake, McLean's Island, what's it called up there? I forget the name of the third one up in Kashmir, but the vast majority of the losses that we saw were in those areas. And so we can look at things at the large scale like that, or courtesy of Dave Pedley, we can look at small scale changes. We can start to ascribe reasons for canopy loss or canopy gain. So again, this is Dave's work, where he's basically looked at the change in canopy cover at the individual property level as a consequence of development intensity. And so one of the things that Dave's been able to do with his work is basically, again, at the individual property level, be able to tell us whether or not different forms of intensification have resulted in more or less tree canopy cover loss. So in this figure, what you're seeing is that in terms of overall loss, forms of intensification like comprehensive redevelopment or amalgamation lead to greater tree canopy cover loss than, for example, just a simple rebuild or infill. So it doesn't tell the whole story of what Dave's research is. He in fact did a talk just a month ago on his research that I hope you were able to see here at the GRI, but it gives you an idea that once we have these multi-temporal data sets, we're able to start looking at reasons for loss and gain as opposed to just knowing that loss or gain occurred. So quite a powerful, I guess, application of that data. One of the other things that we're heading towards is looking at being able to model the benefits that trees provide us in a spatially explicit way. So I showed this slide earlier on, but I've added to it a little bit here. So we know that, or at least I hope I've made the compelling argument that urban forests provide many benefits. But one of the things is that benefits, I guess, vary quite a lot with tree structure. So a small tree with little leaf area provides some benefits. A large tree with lots of leaf area provides many more benefits. And so if we want to understand how benefits change from one part of a city to another, from one neighborhood to the next, from one ward to the next, what we need to be able to do is understand how tree structure changes across those different spatial units as well. If we understand how tree structure changes across those different spatial units, we can then model the benefits that different neighborhoods get. So we could basically understand from an ecosystem service perspective, does Fendleton get more benefit than Woolston gets? Does Island get more benefits than Northwood gets? So on and so forth. And then we could actually make management decisions at the local council or local authority level that would rectify some of those inequities or imbalances. So we're going about this by I guess using what we're able to do with remote sensing to better quantify the structure of individual trees citywide, and we're starting at the plot scale. So typically, what this type of work requires is an understanding of tree structure and crown conditions. So whether or not the crown is full and healthy and leafy, or whether it's sparse and unhealthy. And then obviously tree size as well. So the height of the tree, the crown diameter of the tree, the crown depth, so on and so forth. So that's what this type of work requires. And that's historically been done by ground-based assessments. So that's historically been done by sending teams around, measuring all the trees in a plot, maybe doing that in another 200 different plots across the city, and then sort of scaling up or interpolating citywide. Well, I think we can do better than that with remote sensing data. So that's what we're trialing. We've used our laser scanning acquisition capabilities and our multispectral sensors to be able to capture, I guess, not only spectral data, but structural data for trees in hundreds of plots around the city. And this is one of the things that my PhD student, Gunjan Sharma, has been working on. So she's basically captured point cloud data and multispectral data for plots citywide. And she's looking at whether or not our ability to determine some of those key structural parameters is dependent on the complexity of the landscape itself. So what she's found, perhaps unsurprisingly, is that the simpler the tree structure, the simpler the plot type, the easier it is to get better estimates of tree height accuracy, crown depth accuracy, all of those structural metrics that we need for ecosystem service modeling. So if you go from environments like this, where you've just got a bunch of individual trees, it's relatively easy. But if you get to those more complex environments with lots of understory vegetation, lots of overlapping crowns, it gets very, very difficult, or at least relatively difficult, to use even high quality data like laser scanning and multispectral imagery to be able to tease out those key structural metrics that we need to to estimate ecosystem services with. So we're continuing this work, or rather Gunjan's continuing this work. She's looking at what improvements we might be able to make by using sort of more high-tech data sets. So we've got a UAV laser scanning system. We've got access to a backpack laser scanning system that we can use from the ground. And she's going to see whether or not she can integrate those data sets to supplement the ALS and multispectral imagery to provide, I guess, not only better estimates of what she's done already, but also to creep into the diameter, tree stem diameter space and crown dieback, which are very key, I guess, parameters for a lot of the ecosystem service models that we use. And of course, the long-term goal there, as I said, sort of alluded to earlier on, would be to map ecosystem service provision citywide, to be able to say, you know, again, these areas have high ecosystem service values based on the tree structure in those neighborhoods, and these areas have low ecosystem service values, thus sort of, I guess, catalyzing, you know, council action in the areas that have relatively low benefits. So let's come right back to the beginning of the presentation. I think nature out there is really fantastic, but the reality is, I think it's really critically important for the vast majority of Kiwis to be able to have nature in our cities. And what our research group is really focused on is the use of spatial analysis and spatial data sets to I guess, quantify trees and green spaces with the end goal of ultimately providing more nature where we live, where we work, and where we play. And with that, I will end the talk and open the floor to any comments or questions or ideas. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm interpreting your question to mean species diversity. Yeah. So that is incredibly important for a lot of the ecosystem service models. You need to know what the species is because they do have different, I guess, different characteristics, and so knowing what species it is really important. It's also one of the most challenging things to do. So from a remote sensing perspective, if we have a forest that has 3 species in it, it's very easy to essentially run classification models and identify the individual crowns of those 3 different species. So if we have a finite set of target feature classes, it's generally pretty easy. In an urban forest, oftentimes you're looking at cities having hundreds of different species. And so to be able to actually use remote sensing data to ascribe species to each individual tree is virtually impossible. I know there are some research groups trying that using hyperspectral data, but it remains very much an open research challenge. Questions or comments? Yeah.
I'm thinking about the time series and using area to make the maps.
Yeah.
You know, what area photography how is possible that
I think it's really challenging. So I haven't tried to go back and do that work, but there's a recent report from the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment that was titled "Are We Building Harder, Hotter Cities?" I believe it was called. And they commissioned Manaki Whenua-Lenka Research to do some work at looking at the temporal changes over, I think, an 80-year chronosequence in terms of how canopy cover is changing in cities. And from a methodological perspective, it was extremely complicated, and they ended up having to use, methods that provided an answer, but maybe were a little bit dubious. Yeah. Questions or comments? Yeah. 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 That's, I mean, I think every researcher would be able to would love to be able to sort of do all the things. I mean, I think you're right in saying that an ecosystem is more than just trees. I think the term ecosystem services is applied to many different sort of I guess environments. In terms of the methodologies that you could potentially use, I'm working with a visitor from Wuhan University right now to look at how trees and sort of soundscapes interact. So possibly, but no, I think there's lots of really fun and interesting research questions that we could do in the urban forestry space. And yeah, I invite anybody who'd like to collaborate on that stuff to come along. Yeah, Simon. I don't know whether that's an audience plant, but yeah, Susie Dang looked at this. I guess I was a small part of that work, but yeah, Susie, who recently graduated from here and is in the UK now, looked at the longitudinal survey, the relationship between green spaces and mental health over the 40-year chrono sequence, I think it was. She found some relationships. Broadly, the science supports the importance of trees and green spaces for improvements in mental health, but I think we could still do quite a lot in that space in New Zealand. I think Susie's work was a good start, but there were a lot of methodological oversimplifications that were necessary within the context of a PhD chapter, but that we could definitely improve upon. Property prices. I guess the typical thing that you would see is property prices are higher in neighborhoods or on properties with existing mature vegetation. I haven't personally, no, I haven't looked at that personally. So that's another thing that potentially could be looked at. Yeah.
Locations, you know, you could identify burn.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Definitely. So as part of the Christchurch City Council setting its target of 20%, they knew that they were at 13.5%. They needed to get to 20. They undertook an internal analysis to look at planting spaces throughout the city and trying to determine whether, you know, with a bit of sort of modeling scenarios, you know, if we planted all of these areas at 80%, what potential target could we hit if we planted them at 50%? Yeah, so they've used that data as, I guess, the first step in understanding potential plantable spaces. And then they've taken it a step further where they have identified, like, I guess, the easy wins. So the council at the moment are planting roughly 5,000 landscape grade sized trees every year. And they base that, I guess, importantly on identifying plantable locations within parks, specifically in areas that are, I guess, poorly represented by canopy cover currently. So they're looking at that question of equity and trying to address that through planting there.
A question online.
Okay.
And apologies to people online for not repeating the question.
Oh yeah.
I'll ask you to do that.
Yeah.
Further questions. Question is about the canopy data for New Zealand cities. Are they available?
Yes. So I guess I don't need to repeat that one because you've just said it.
Just said it.
Yeah. Yeah. The data are freely available. We don't have like a platform to share it, but we'd be, you know, just get in touch and we'll be more than happy to share it. Yeah.
Other questions in the room?
That's good. So the question is roughly about what incentives exist in order to at least maintain or possibly increase canopy cover. The easy answer: there are no direct incentives that are used to sort of modify that behavior. There are some sort of regulatory approaches that are related to tree retention. So you can't cut down every tree on your property, but there's very strict conditions against which that sort of applies. So the trees have to be listed in a unitary or district council plan. So they have to be essentially be protected individual trees. There's very few of those in any city. So the reality is that trees on private property in cities all throughout New Zealand, the vast majority of them are totally unprotected. And that's why we're seeing these declines in urban tree canopy cover in most cities that we're looking at. The incentive side of things, those are very, very rare. Some councils have programs that will provide free trees. Other councils will provide sort of educational, incentives, educational outreach, that type of thing. But there's nothing like tax rebates or other sort of interesting ways to incentivize retaining or planting new trees. The man directly to your left is literally doing a chapter in his PhD on incentives at the moment. So you could talk to him over a coffee.
Just one online first. Yeah, Justin, you already spoke about the challenges of tree species identification from remote sensing, usually meaning optical imagery. Question is about using LiDAR data. Is it possible?
Okay, so again, if you have a limited suite of sort of target classes that you're trying to classify into species A, B, and C, and those trees have sufficiently different structures, then yes, you could. But again, from an urban forestry perspective, when you're looking at hundreds of different tree species at different stages of their lives, they could be juvenile trees, they could be mature trees. The challenge is at present, it remains open, put it that way. I think there's the possibility of some very big data type research methods, deep learning on all sorts of either structural and optical data sets that could take in a variety of different factors and try to solve that problem. But at the present time anyways, it remains an open research question. People have done it for limited palettes of species. People have done it well for limited palettes of species. One of my PhD students, Joe, he has recently submitted. He had reasonably good results when he was just trying to classify 7 common species. But you get up to hundreds of common species, and it's not possible.
Okay, sorry, it was just have you actually quantified the canopy cover on private list?
Yeah, so was the canopy cover on private versus public land quantified? The answer is yes. So for each of the cities that I've worked on, those numbers have been provided to the councils. They're in the reports. I don't know them off the top of my head, but I believe the rough values were something like 70% of canopy cover, 80% of canopy cover was on privately owned land, and 20 or 30% on publicly. But that just reflects the fact that most land in a city boundary is privately owned. If you look at the relative canopy cover on private versus public land tends to have higher canopy cover compared to private land, if that distinction makes sense.
There's a question here as well, which I think is clarification based on Maria's policy question. To clarify, is it important for tree cover to be spread out across an urban space? Do council targets allow for tree plantings to be clustered given space availability? Yeah.
So I guess my personal view is that it's important to have trees where people live. So even within a city, and I guess this is oftentimes what some of the proposed solutions are. It's we can remove all these trees here as long as we plant trees somewhere else, but the somewhere else typically is lower population density areas. And so I think that has sort of the issue of essentially allowing loss of tree cover in the neighborhoods that need it most, the neighborhoods with high population densities, and higher tree cover in areas where there's low population densities and relatively few people living. So I think there is a fundamental issue there with sort of planting elsewhere. I know that cities will try to sort of mitigate against that by again thinking spatially and trying to relate tree canopy cover to individual sort of spatial units, but it's a challenge.
I was a bit surprised to see the canopy cover, the low canopy cover ranking of Christchurch versus other cities, given that it's the garden city. But then thinking about it, it's partly because the boundary of the city extends quite far out from the urban area.
Right. Absolutely.
Which of course skews the percentage cover downwards because all that is agricultural land.
Exactly.
So my question is there another metric where we can measure the actual urban fabric canopy cover? Do you have an idea of the percentage there? And is it higher or lower than the 13.56%?
Yeah. So, you know, if this work wasn't work that the city council funded, that they wanted, you know, if I didn't have to use the boundaries that they suggested, what I would have done from a research perspective is probably limited it to, for example, something like SA2 areas that meet certain population thresholds. You know, I think normalizing city or urban boundaries based on, you know, population densities or something like that makes much more sense. There is a StatsNZ data set that looks at urban versus regional boundaries that possibly takes that into account. I'm not sure there are probably people in the room who might have a bit more knowledge of that than I do, but yeah, I think from a canopy cover perspective, it rarely makes sense to look at, I guess, administrative boundaries like these because, well, they simply don't necessarily represent where people actually live. It's just a city boundary.
It does look from just visually from the maps that within the urban area there's a loss.
Yeah.
Probably more significant than 2% you've got there.
Yeah. That's a rendering thing, but actually there are cases where cities, I'm aware of certain cities in the world where they set a canopy cover target and they were at the political risk of not meeting that. And so what they did was they changed they gerrymandered, they changed their boundary to incorporate like a big natural area, and all of a sudden their canopy cover shot up. So I think that's the danger of using sort of these city boundaries as opposed to population based boundaries.
Yeah.
Yes. So the question was around which city had the highest canopy cover in New Zealand, and that city was Picton. And again, this gets back to Matt's point. The reason for that is the boundary extends out to the hills surrounding Picton, which are entirely forested. So the city itself probably has much lower canopy cover than that, but it's surrounded by forests. And I mean, in a way, that's the same thing with Wellington's canopy cover here. Wellington is the benefit of having hillsides that surround it that are covered forests, whereas Christchurch is surrounded by pasture and agriculture and so forth. So yeah, it might change a little bit. Yeah.
Any last questions?
Yeah.
Structure,
Mhm.
finding all the waterways for the forest,
Right.
especially climate change.
Yeah.
Versus just forest.
So the question was around research that has mapped blue-green infrastructure in New Zealand as opposed to just the green infrastructure. And the easy answer for me is I don't know. I haven't come across it if there is. There's lots of people who look at blue infrastructure. So they've also sort of, I don't know, maybe we should team up. Yeah. Okay. Yes. Yeah. Right. Okay. Yeah.
Last question from online related to the level of detail that you've got in the canopy cover.
Yep.
I think within these maps, as you zoom in,
Yep.
For example, in Christchurch, can you tell the canopy cover per street or per building for urban areas?
Yeah. So I guess the question is already heard, but the answer is yes, we can do that. So the data set that I used for these particular canopy cover maps, I used the raw LiDAR point clouds, which I then interpolated into half-meter canopy height models. So from a raster perspective, the individual pixels that were either tree or not tree were half a meter. But then I actually used the very fine resolution RGB data to sort of improve the boundary of those I guess individual trees or canopies. So from a scale perspective, these data sets could be used to look at or canopy cover on individual properties or individual streets. I guess being a regional or being a citywide data set, I think the quality would decrease if you looked at sort of individual properties, individual streets, but it's certainly possible to do.
Right. Well, it's been great to hear this discussion. It's generated lots of interest. It's always exciting to have lots of questions.
Yeah.
Let everyone go off to the rest of the day. But thank you very much, Justin, for a really interesting, fascinating talk. And yeah, I'm sure you'll get lots of people reach out to you regarding access to data and so on.
Yeah, I'd love that. That'd be
yeah.
great. Very cool. Thanks everybody for coming along. And I think the reason that people have an interest in this type of thing is because we all live in cities. You know, that's the reality. So we all want nature where we live and where we work and where we play. Yeah. So
True.
thanks again for coming along.